I was born on December 21st, 1991, which is coincidentally the same day that the Soviet Union collapsed and 2 years following the Romanian Revolution and the fall of communism in Eastern and Central Europe. My family and I left Romania when I was very young, and though I am wholly Romanian, I have always felt alienated from my family's past, from what Romania was, not necessarily from what it is now. I've tried my hardest to ask the right questions, the tough questions, and in doing so, the circumstances have sometimes been funny, but they have not always been very enlightening. I once asked my grandmother, for instance, these are my grandparents, what it was like to be alive during the Cold War. You know, did she remember what it was like with a nuclear bomb being about to go off at any moment? And she just stared at me and said, "What bomb? I had my own problems, okay?" My grandmother approached living her life in a way that had little to do with what BBC was reporting. And in fact, many people under communism did. They, in many ways, completely detached themselves from what you and I might deem as their oppressor. Now, that doesn't mean that they weren't necessarily completely aware of what was going on, but they definitely chose to move on with their lives. So it was difficult to be an individual. In fact, it was highly discouraged. But there were others, like my grandfather, who spent each night in the cold, freezing basement listening to banned radio stations, like BBC. And he had this chance of knowing what was going on through that perspective. But this doesn't mean that I really understand what happened. I have this comprehensible version of what happened, which I've put together with my own assumptions and stories like these. But it's not necessarily the whole truth. But it does help me feel less alienated from my family's past, and actually, in fact, more aware of my own present. Alienation. The feeling of alienation that we have right now in this digital culture that we live through is strangely similar to the kind of alienation that people under communism also felt. So in both situations, we're not supposed to admit to alienation. And I'm calling this era the weird era for a number of reasons. First of all, for me, it implies a sense of uneasiness and discomfort that is undeniable. Second of all, this era differs from others because it thrives on precisely the terms that it is both easy and comfortable. Finally, I'm reappropriating the title of a Deer Hunter album, which you see here, called Weird Era Continued, which I was listening to a lot in high school when I first started noticing how deeply digital technology had infiltrated our daily lives. When we look at the past, we judge people for the way that they behaved. And I often wonder how myself and everyone around me will be judged by future generations, if we'll be considered selfish and insincere. Just as we judge people in the past by applying generalizations or expecting collective guilt, we also judge people for who they appear to be on the internet. And though this digital context is strange and weird to humanity, the actual content isn't, because tackling alienation, lacking a sense of individualism, and an unhealthy self-absorption is an older story, and one that my family certainly experienced just as I do. What we are lacking more of in our weird era is sincerity. What we have is insincerity. The internet makes us feel like we have this connection with other people. It encourages a false sense of connectivity, so it encourages insincerity. So I'm going to focus on the internet because we all already have a relationship with this facet of digital culture. A powerful and incredible tool, invented by a privileged few, and as it turned out, for the many. So I'm talking about Web 2.0, which is basically just user-generated content, remixability, usability, all that we now regard as the internet. Web 2.0 is at the core of the increasing accessibility of the internet. So you have these platforms through which to express yourself. But the problem is that you can only express yourself within the boundaries of the platforms. So they make you feel as if you are free, but really you're creating the content for the benefit of the use of the platform. So in a sense, we have to reclaim what we've actually already been given. And as time passes, virtuality and reality amalgamate, and our internet identities become to look a lot more like our real-life identities. Everything you are on the internet goes through a process of self-consent. So you pick what your avatar is and who you follow, and everyone is watching. My good friend Anna, she said, making a friend is great, but when an online community sees you making that friend, it's something else entirely. It gives you a comforting, self-serving validation. And I do often wonder how little of what we do is a sense of self-actualization, as in the fulfillment of our potential, and how much of it is just a form of self-validation. So when you share or retweet, that's what I'm talking about. Are we performing? Because if we are, I'm not convinced that we're doing it to the best of our abilities. But I do know that we're making a conscious choice. It's not against our will. We're making a choice to enter this field of visibility. This reminds me of a panopticon, which is this. So this is a panopticon, which is traditionally a central tower which can observe all the prisoners at the same time. Foucault said that the individual acts in both roles, as both prisoner and guard. So by being aware that they might be watched at any moment, they actually self-discipline. So the guard is actually irrelevant. So you're in there. You've become the principal of your own subjection. And all your virtual friends and followers are in there too. Sorry. So I'm going to look at what I think are good performers on the internet. There are examples all across the world, but I'm going to look at the Middle East. There's many examples of banned rap groups with their virtual anti-government protests. There was recently news that 14-year-old Malala Yousafzai was shot in the head by the Taliban for campaigning for women's rights to education. She started a blog at just 11 years old. There's also Asma Mahfouz, who arguably sparked the Egyptian revolution when she posted a video of herself to YouTube pleading for support in the first protests. It was her sincerity that inspired people to leave the safety of their homes, some at the cost of their lives, and to go and protest at Tahrir Square. This video brings to me a sense of the realness that comes with virtuality, that you and I can watch someone like Asma and be triggered by her words to such an emotional depth that we're inspired to feel or actually do something in the so-called real world. And we can't break these geographical boundaries and borders without the internet. But I'm not suggesting that all internet performance has to be politically fueled. I love a Tumblr entirely dedicated to collecting the patterns of Bill Cosby's sweaters. The Cosby Sweater Project. It's all captivating in its own way. It's disarming. By disarming, I just mean that it disarms us from our daily automaton lives. The thing is, we don't have to be under communism to fit this dystopian-sounding reality where we're not actually acting like individuals. And we sometimes even feel like we are, which is the weird part. And we live this lie on a daily basis. But when you look at the internet, you see a lot of self-censorship. We're already plugged in, and the internet's definitely staying, but most of us have no idea of how we're capable of influencing and affecting the future. This is Václav Havel. He's a Czech dissident from communism, and he's my personal hero. I have his book over there. And he said that human beings are compelled to live within a lie, but they can only be compelled to do so because they are in fact capable of living in this way. The weird era records our every move. In the future, they will largely know what we were like, and certainly what our digital self-censored versions of ourselves were like. So this is one of the reasons I think that we really should perform on the internet. But throw a wrench in. There's nothing wrong with being an absurdist, non-you on the internet. The point is that you should just never feel like you don't control your own identity, because you do. So being a non-you on the internet is in its own way an act of performance, art, because it's not insincere either. You're making a choice which is true to you. And that may lead to some guy in the future asking themselves who Pumpkin Farts is, how he could have worked at Tacoma Dome in 1983 if he was born in 1988. I find this all wonderful, and I've actually found it more enjoyable to create absurdist identities for myself on the internet than to make a real website for my music. The thing about absurdist identities like these and absurdist acts of sincerity is that they make us realize that we are uncomfortable immediately if something's out of place. You know when people say that's not normal, or even worse, that's not true? There's a group called Orange Alternative, who were a Polish dissident group under communism, and they graffitied red dwarfs everywhere they could. Just red dwarfs, that is what I said. And the state responded by painting over them, to which the passerby would have to acknowledge, whether they wanted to or not, and have to face this truth, they weren't actually allowed to do anything without the permission of the state. They were being oppressed and ignoring it, and instead of questioning the reality, they were just accepting it. My parents and grandparents had a very difficult time feeling like individuals under communism. But that's one of the reasons that communism succeeded in oppressing its people for so long. So whether done as a form of virtual protests right now, or as a dissident group under communism, both acts of absurdity point out very simply that we just do not question our reality enough. We do question our political world, though, don't we? We criticize our politicians for their lack of sincerity and lack of transparency, but we rarely exhibit these characteristics ourselves. And politicians, for the most part, they come from the same places that we do. Admitting that we're blinded to our insincerity gives us the power to counteract social norms and constructs. This is where creation comes in. Digital creation that is aware of the world's discomfort with sincerity is actually incredibly powerful. Now, I think it's safe to assume that in the near future, you will waste some time on the internet. And the next time that you do, and trust me, there will never be a convenient time to do this, ask yourself to be really honest and answer, is this fulfilling? Because the tragedy of this daily digestion of digital media is that it might actually be leading to disenchantment. And there's nothing more depressing, disheartening, disengaging, and limiting than disenchantment. And you're not the only victim of this. But frankly, I don't want you to see yourself as a victim because that's not inspiring. It doesn't feel good. You have to remember, though, that a lot of people in the world don't even have access to this digital world. I mean, even in the Arab Spring, where the internet is seen as an important factor, there are actually only 2 million users out of a total population of 220 million people. You have the privilege of internet access. It is your responsibility to ask yourselves a few questions about it because others cannot, even should they want to. You have the privilege to work with digital electronic equipment to make and break ground in art, science, history, art, music, film. It really goes on forever. All facets of human understanding and collective innovation. All expression of freedom belongs to all, and art and the future belongs to all. But in this world, most people don't feel that. And I hope we can agree that the future is not just for those who can be born into the right of enjoying it, or for those who can afford it. So while you might feel like you don't have time to waste revolutionizing the future through every online and offline move, that you don't have your own democratic revolution to trigger, it doesn't mean that you're not oppressed also. Because democracy is imperfect. Our world is definitely imperfect. And the internet, the way that most of us use it, is imperfect. But action starts with awareness. We have to acknowledge on a very personal level that we tend to be satisfied with insincerity, and that it is this that hinders us from actually taking control of our own future. Because I think that when we use digital media with a sense of awareness, reclaiming the future is actually possible. And this tells me that the future is not disenchanting or disenchantment, but on the contrary, it is actually enchantment. I think in building a kind of panorama of people's daily lives, we start to understand more about what happened in the past, because they start to look more like us. So what I mean by that is, when I looked at my family's past, my realization was an alienating one, because it felt like most people don't take to heart what history teaches us. That we can all be broken down. That we would sacrifice our moral values to survive, to blend in. That we would censor ourselves, our art, our creation, at the expense of our identity. All of this must be paid attention to when judging those that came before us, but especially when judging ourselves. In the end, what you get out of the weird era is entirely up to you. I'm not telling you what to do, because I'm actually trying to challenge you to figure that out, to take control of your own self-actualization. The wonderful aspect about the fact that we're all becoming more and more hooked to underwater wires and magic machines is that we're actually holding what can empower ourselves and one another to live in truth. We can change things. We can tackle social alienation and urban desolation. We can take control through small acts of sincerity or absurdity. We can maintain the enchantment that comes with living. This is how we will reach true and innovative creation in the future, whether it comes down to music, film, art, science, history, humanitarian aid, honestly, anything. Thank you.